Black CEO, insulted at Billionaire mansion by dawn, she shut down their $1.9 empire. Hello everyone! Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. People like you should never be allowed inside a place like this. The sentence sliced across the ballroom like a blade dragged over, glass clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. Conversation died mid-air. Crystal flutes froze halfway to painted lips. Every chandelier in the billionaire's mansion seemed to pulse in stunned silence, its gold light trembling across a sea of tuxedos and jewel-colored gowns. And at the center of that sudden stillness stood two women. One, dressed in a flowing yellow gown, leaning forward with a posture sharpened by arrogance and entitlement, her fingers stabbing the air like a weapon. The other, tall, poised, wrapped in a white evening dress, held a champagne flute with a grace that didn't waver even under the heat of humiliation. Guests shifted like a single organism, heads turning, breaths tightening, the weight of spectacle drawing them in. The billionaire's grand ballroom, with its forest of gold columns and lakes of marble flooring, suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to listen. The woman in yellow stepped closer, her voice rising. "I said, look at me. Who invited you here? Who thought it was a good idea to let you walk into a mansion like this, dressed like—" She stopped, letting her eyes sweep critically over the woman in white, trying to look expensive. A ripple of gasps and stolen glances tremored through the room. But the woman in white did not respond. She simply lifted her eyes, calm and unbroken, her fingers resting lightly around the stem of the flute. The gesture was so subtle, so effortlessly composed, that it unsettled the onlookers more than any display of anger could have. The silence she stood in was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of someone who could speak, but didn't need to. From across the ballroom, the music began to falter. The string quartet hesitated, bows hovering above strings as if uncertain whether they should continue playing or disappear into the wallpaper. One violinist exchanged a frightened look with the cellist beside him. No one wanted to be the background soundtrack to a social execution. The woman in yellow, Avery Calder, heiress to the estate, daughter of the wealthiest family in the region, misread all of it as validation. "Everyone sees it," she continued, loud enough for her voice to bounce off the chandelier crystal. "Everyone knows you don't belong here. This gala is for real donors, real families, real money. You think putting on a white dress makes you one of us?" The phrase "one of us" clung to the air like smoke. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to our character. The woman in white, tall, statuesque, dark-skinned, wearing understated diamond earrings that caught the chandelier light like quiet starlight, shifted her weight subtly, the hem of her gown brushing the marble floor. Her presence absorbed the room's venom and did not spill a drop. Avery wasn't done. "Say something," she snapped. "Defend yourself. Or is silence the only thing you people are good at?" The words detonated. This time, the crowd reacted not with gasps, but with the kind of stiff, involuntary recoil that only appears when a line has been crossed too clearly to ignore. Even those who shared Avery's prejudices felt the weight of hearing them spoken aloud. A man near the champagne table set down his glass too quickly, the crystal clicking against marble. A woman in emerald whispered a horrified, "Oh my God!" Someone else shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of where to look. But the woman in white stood unmoved. She lifted her gaze to Avery with a composure so measured, so effortlessly regal, that the entire ballroom felt it. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was evaluation, as if she were quietly deciding how large a price should be paid for what had just happened. Avery mistook the pause for victory and stepped even closer, her finger almost touching the woman's face. "You walk into my family's mansion and expect respect? You weren't even on the guest list. You think money can buy culture, class, entry?" Let me tell you. The woman in white finally shifted the champagne flute to her other hand, a motion so small, so soft, so deliberate, but it changed everything. Because in that instant, the air around her thickened, charged, precise, the kind of charged silence that precedes a storm no one can stop. Phones began to rise around the room. Someone whispered, "She's not reacting. Why isn't she reacting?" Another murmured, "She looks like she's the one hosting." Avery, flushed with adrenaline and self-righteous cruelty, leaned in for one last blow. "I don't care who you think you are. Tonight, you're nothing." The woman in white exhaled slowly, eyes calm, voice quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. Not for long, and the room understood they had just witnessed the moment a dynasty sealed its own fate. The ballroom did not return to life after the insult. It hovered, paused in a fragile suspension, like a crystal chandelier holding its breath. Even the air seemed to retreat, as though the mansion itself refused to interfere in what was unfolding at its center. Avery Calder straightened, the yellow folds of her gown sweeping the marble like a warning flag. For a moment she looked triumphant, chest lifted, chin high, basking in the echo of her own cruelty. She believed she had conquered the room. She believed silence meant victory. But the silence didn't belong to her. It belonged to the woman in white. Solène Ward, though no one here knew her name, yet stood tall, the hem of her gown falling around her feet like ivory water. Her champagne flute remained delicately angled between her fingers, not a tremor in sight. Every element of her posture radiated one truth. She had not been defeated. She had simply chosen not to strike back, not yet. The shift was small, almost invisible at first. A single guest near the front adjusted her necklace nervously. Another grazed his thumb along the rim of his glass, pretending to be engrossed by it but unable to tear his eyes away from Solène. A man in a navy tuxedo leaned slightly forward, his brows knitting in recognition not of her identity, but of her aura. "Something's off," he whispered under his breath. "Not off. Different." Avery, unaware of the tremor running through the room's collective awareness, tossed her hair in annoyance. "Unbelievable!" she muttered loudly. "She doesn't even deny it." Of course she doesn't. But no one laughed with her this time. Not one sympathetic chuckle, not one echo of support, not even a polite attempt to diffuse the tension. The silence sharpened, taking form, a tension that felt like the last breath before a chandelier drops. Someone in the back whispered, "She's not reacting." "That's strange." Another replied, "That's not fear. She's thinking." The mansion staff felt it first. A valet near the door paused mid-step, the tray in his hand shifting only a centimeter before he corrected it. A waitress slowed her movement through the crowd, her eyes darting between the two women, sensing the storm that etiquette forbade her from acknowledging. Even the chandelier lights dimmed slightly as the house's automated system compensated for temperature shifts from the gathering crowd. Avery noticed none of it. She was too busy basking in what she assumed was dominance. "You know," she continued loudly, "I've met people who try to sneak into events like this before. They always give themselves away. No class, no connections, no access. But this," she waved her hand dismissively toward Solène, "this is desperation dressed in silk." A few heads turned sharply at that. Not toward Solène, toward Avery. Her tone carried something ugly now, something feral, something you weren't supposed to expose in a place built to disguise the worst parts of wealth. Solène's gaze flicked not to Avery, but to the crowd, a scan so precise it felt like a surgeon taking inventory before an operation. She saw the discomfort, the shifting weight, the cracks in the guest's confidence. She saw the room turning not toward her yet, but away from Avery. Avery caught the change too late. "What?" she snapped at a woman in emerald. "Do you have something to say?" The woman shook her head quickly, eyes avoiding Avery's, but her glance slipped toward Solène, and that sealed it. The room's allegiance was beginning to slide quietly, imperceptibly toward the figure in white. Solène didn't smirk, didn't move, didn't claim the shift. Power didn't need to celebrate itself. Instead, she took a single breath, steady and measured, and the entire ballroom seemed to inhale with her. The chandelier crystals vibrated gently, scattering flecks of gold across her gown, giving her the appearance of someone lit from within. Avery felt the change then, finally. Her voice faltered. Why? Why are you all looking at me like that? Because the illusion of superiority had cracked. Because the victim she thought shed humiliate stood untouchable. Because dignity, when held firmly, exposes arrogance like a floodlight. Solène lowered her gaze to Avery not as a challenge, but as though she were studying a fragile creature that had just realized its claws were paper. Avery's breath hitched. Don't look at me like you pity me. But pity wasn't what glimmered in Solène's eyes. It was decision, a quiet verdict forming in the stillness. Behind the two women, the string quartet exchanged uncertain glances. Their bows hovered above the strings, waiting for an unspoken command to resume or flee. A cellist mouthed silently. Should we? The violinist's subtle shake of the head answered everything. This moment wasn't theirs to interrupt. Avery straightened, suddenly desperate to reclaim the room. Fine. If you won't speak, then let me make something very clear. But the words never landed, because Solène finally moved, just a slight shift of her wrist, the champagne flute tilting softly, the liquid inside catching the chandelier light in a shimmering curve. And the movement, small, elegant, controlled, made the entire room freeze. Not because it was violent, not because it was threatening, but because it felt like the prelude to an irreversible choice. Avery's voice caught in her throat. The crowd leaned in as one. The air tightened its grip. Solène raised her eyes fully, meeting Avery's anger with a calm that was terrifying precisely because it was gentle. No rush, no tremor, no fear, just inevitability. And with that gaze, the room understood. Avery Calder had not just insulted a guest. She had insulted a woman who was about to rewrite the night, quietly, thoroughly, and without lifting her voice. The tension in the ballroom didn't ease, it thickened. Avery's breath came short and uneven, a stark contrast to the elegant calm she had tried to project moments earlier. The yellow satin of her gown shimmered beneath the chandelier light, but instead of glowing, it now seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. Her eyes, once sharp with cruelty, darted between the guests who were no longer aligned with her. Meanwhile, Solène Ward remained perfectly still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lift a hand. She simply stood there, a pillar of white silk and quiet authority, absorbing the room's shifting currents without allowing any of it to disturb her posture. It was this steadiness, this unshakable stillness that made people take notice. A group near the grand staircase exchanged hushed whispers. One man leaned toward another, keeping his voice low, but not low enough to avoid drifting into the charged air. She's not reacting the way Avery expected. Would you, if you were guilty of something? No, that's not the point. She's controlled. Too controlled. The murmur spread through the room the way ripples spread across glittering water, delicate, quiet, but unmistakably gathering force. Even those who had arrived fully prepared to overlook Avery's behavior could no longer ignore the imbalance between the two women. One was unraveling. The other was calculating. Avery swallowed hard and tried to reclaim the moment with a trembling voice. Everyone can see what's happening, she said, forcing a brittle laugh. She's just standing there, acting like she's above us. As if she owns the room. But that was precisely the problem. She did look like she owned it. Her gown caught the chandelier's reflection like moving moonlight. Her expression, serene but sharp, carried the poise of someone who was not intimidated, only deciding how much patience she had left. The wealthy, the powerful, the socially trained could smell hierarchy shift as quickly as they could smell expensive perfume. And right now, the scent of change was unmistakable. Avery noticed it too late. Don't look at her like that, she snapped suddenly at the crowd. She's not special. She's not. Her next words cracked in her throat. Because at that moment, Solène lifted her eyes fully, not with aggression, not even with disdain, but with a chilling neutrality that struck deeper than any threat. It was the kind of look people gave when they had assessed a situation and reached a conclusion. Avery felt the bottom drop out of her confidence. What are you staring at? She demanded, but the edge in her voice betrayed panic more than control. Solène didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was a verdict, not a void. Behind Avery, her mother, an impeccably dressed woman with pearls glistening at her collarbone, placed one cautious hand on her daughter's forearm. "Avery," she whispered urgently. "Stop." The warning was barely more than breath, but it carried the weight of someone who finally sensed danger. Avery pulled away. "No, she can't just stand there looking down on me. On us." Her mother's jaw tightened. She understood something her daughter didn't. The woman in white was not standing still because she was powerless. She was standing still because she was choosing restraint. That was the difference between someone clinging to borrowed power and someone who was power. Solène gently rotated her wrist, allowing the champagne flute to catch the chandelier light, as if testing the gold glow before setting the glass on a nearby tray. The motion was immaculate, thin, precise, intentional, the kind of movement wealthy people recognized instantly, expensive ease. The grace of someone raised by no one but sculpted by discipline. The confidence of control. The crowd shifted further. Not physically, no one dared move that obviously, but their alignment tilted. Eyes widened, spines straightened. A murmur started again, this time laced with a different tone. Recognition. A man in a tailored charcoal suit whispered to his wife, "Whoever she is, she's somebody." His wife nodded slowly. Only people with real power stay that calm. The statement spread, passed from one spectator to another, until even those near the back of the ballroom felt its truth settle into the room. Avery stepped forward again, trying to regain the spotlight she had lost. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble, but the sound no longer dominated the space. "Answer me!" she barked. "Why are you looking at everyone like we're beneath you?" Solène blinked once, a calm, unhurried movement that carried more weight than Avery's shouting. Then she spoke, just 2 words, soft, precise, perfectly measured. "Are you done?" The question wasn't a question. It was a dismantling. Avery's expression shattered. Heat rose in blotches along her neck and collarbone. She looked around at the guests, desperate to find even one sympathetic face in the crowd. She found none. The room now gravitated around the woman in white. Her mother leaned in again. "Avery, stop speaking. Now." But Avery's voice, trembling with equal parts fear and humiliation, kept pouring out. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though her volume had shrunk. "I don't care who you think you are." Solène tilted her head ever so slightly, examining her the way one examines a crack in glass before deciding whether it's repairable or whether it signals structural collapse. Then, calmly, she said, "You should." A breathless hush washed across the room, so absolute that even the chandeliers seemed to flicker in response. It was the first moment every guest understood. The insult Avery Calder delivered at the beginning of the night was about to cost her family far more than pride. It was about to cost them their empire. The whispering started before Avery even realized she'd lost control of the room. It began at the edges near the marble columns and velvet-draped archways, where older guests, board members, and longtime family allies exchanged tight glances, heavy with an unspoken truth. They knew something Avery didn't, or rather something she refused to see. The Calder empire was buckling. Richard Calder, the patriarch, stood near the head of the long banquet table. His suit was immaculate, his posture carefully measured, but the tension in his hands betrayed him. He watched his daughter with a stare full of warnings she could not hear. Because arrogance speaks louder in its own head than any father ever could. He cleared his throat once, quietly, a subtle signal, a plea for Avery to step back. She ignored it. And the guests took notice of that too, how the heiress was spiraling while her father's face folded into controlled panic. A woman in ruby leaned toward her husband. "He looks afraid." Her husband's jaw tightened. "Because she's pushing the wrong person." But Avery, drowning in her own righteous cruelty, kept going. She believed reputation was armor. She believed wealth equaled immunity. She believed lineage made her untouchable. She didn't know that the Calder name had already begun to rot from the inside. 6 months earlier, while the tabloids still praised their philanthropy and their gala appearances, Richard Calder had been quietly negotiating for survival. A series of reckless investments had gutted their liquidity. A failed expansion overseas had triggered lawsuits, still sealed behind confidentiality agreements. And a bridge loan to keep their flagship ventures alive was already overdue. They were one deal away from the brink, one signature from collapsing, one refusal from losing everything. And that signature belonged to the woman his daughter was humiliating in front of 200 witnesses. Avery had no idea, but Richard did. His pulse hammered beneath his collar as he watched Solène, her white gown glowing beneath the chandelier's gold haze. He recognized the posture, not the person, but the power. That unnerving, measured presence belonged only to people who controlled outcomes, not reactions. People with leverage. People with capital strong enough to break empires quietly. His heart sank. He feared he knew exactly who she was. Across the table, Avery's mother, elegant in pearls, a woman who had mastered the art of smiling through discomfort, finally stepped forward. She touched Avery's arm with a gentle but urgent grip. "Avery, enough," she whispered. But Avery yanked her arm free. "I'm not done." Her mother exhaled sharply, the sound tight with dread. Because she, too, had seen the signs, the hushed meetings in Richard's study, the sudden selling of assets disguised as portfolio shifts, the bankers returning calls late at night. She knew their empire was fragile, and she knew her daughter was kicking at a fault line. Richard finally stepped forward. "Avery," he said, voice low, "stop this, right now." The room froze. He rarely used that tone, never in public. Avery turned to him, confused, embarrassed, defensive. "Why? She's nobody. She's a guest," he snapped softly, "and you are crossing a line." His daughter blinked, stunned at the reprimand. But Richard wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze was locked onto Solène, and in that moment, the truth settled heavy across his features. He knew, or at least, he suspected. The woman standing in white, silent, composed, untouched by insult, was the very person he had spent months trying to court, persuade, win over. The one investor capable of saving his collapsing $1.9 billion empire with a single stroke of a pen. The woman Avery had chosen to humiliate. His voice broke. "Miss Ward?" he asked, barely audible, as if saying the name too loudly might trigger the downfall he feared. A few guests gasped. One woman covered her mouth. A man dropped his gaze in dawning horror. Avery turned sharply. "Ward? Who is Ward?" But the already changing temperature of the room told her everything she needed to know. She had just insulted the wrong woman. The very wrong woman. Solène merely raised her eyes to Richard, silent and steady. No anger, no satisfaction, just clarity. And the entire ballroom braced for what that clarity meant. For a moment, no one breathed. The name Ward hovered in the air like static, spreading through the ballroom in a slow, dawning wave. Some guests reacted instantly, eyes widening, posture straightening, faces draining of color. Others took longer, pulling at threads of memory, recalling rumors whispered in private lounges and investment circles. Avery was the last to understand. "Ward?" she repeated, confusion knitting her brows. "Why is everyone acting like that's supposed to mean something?" Her mother closed her eyes. Richard didn't move. He couldn't. His body felt carved from stone, his mind spiraling through months of delicate negotiations, frantic calls, and desperate financial stitching. Everything he had been building, everything he had been struggling to keep afloat, suddenly stood on the edge of a cliff. And his daughter had just given it one violent push. Solène Ward lifted her champagne flute. It caught the chandelier's gold glow as she set it down gently on a nearby tray. The gesture, quiet, slow, deliberate, pulled the entire room's attention the way a conductor lifts a baton to silence an orchestra. She didn't need to raise her chin. She didn't need to square her shoulders. Power didn't announce itself. It was simply recognized. Avery stepped back instinctively, as if the sudden gravity around Solène had physically shifted the floor beneath her heels. "What is going on?" she whispered, but her voice was swallowed by the manicured dread rippling across the mansion. Solène finally spoke, her voice low and even. "Mr. Calder." A shiver passed through the guests. Her tone wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It held the cadence of a woman who was used to speaking in boardrooms where millions moved at the sound of her voice. Richard swallowed. "Miss Ward, aye." But she didn't let him finish. Her thumb brushed the edge of her smart bracelet, a movement so slight that some guests missed it. Others didn't, because in high society, everyone recognized the gestures that mattered. A contact activated, a secure signal sent. A chain reaction triggered. Not dramatic. Procedural. Her phone vibrated once. A confirmation. Somewhere, not in the ballroom, not in the mansion, but in the airtight digital corridors of finance, things began to shift. The Calder family's liquidity reserves, their credit lines, their investment partnerships, the bridge loan agreement Richard was praying nobody would look too closely at. Avery blinked, disoriented, as the crowd's energy changed shape, no longer tense, but anticipatory, like a room watching the first domino tilt. "What did you just do?" she asked, voice cracking. Solène didn't answer her. She spoke only to Richard. "Our agreement," she said calmly, "was built on mutual respect." Richard's throat tightened. "Please, Miss Ward, there's been a misunderstanding. My daughter, she didn't know." "No," Solène said softly. "She didn't." Her gaze shifted to Avery, not angry, not vengeful, but so steady it felt like judgment itself. "But you did," she continued, "and you chose not to intervene." A ripple of shock passed through the guests, not at the accusation, but at the truth of it. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had watched him freeze while his daughter spiraled. Richard's fingers twitched at his side. He instinctively reached for the back of a chair, the weight of impending consequence bearing down like a collapsing pillar. "Miss Ward," he whispered, "please. My family, my company, we can resolve this." "Whatever offense, this isn't about offense," Solène said. Her tone lowered further, quiet enough to force the entire room to lean in. "This is about accountability." She tapped her bracelet once more. A second vibration. A silent thunder. Somewhere in the city, lawyers received instructions. Banks received revocation notices. Partners received withdrawal orders. Contracts in pending status flicked instantly from green to red. The Calder empire didn't fall. It was switched off. Guests' phones lit up first notifications from financial apps, whispers of movement in the markets, speculative alerts. Only insiders understood at a glance. A man near the bar gasped faintly. "Oh my God, something just shifted." A woman checked her screen. "This can't be right. They're assets." Another voice. "No." Someone pulled a keystone. "Everything's freezing." Avery spun, frantic. "Why is everyone looking at their phones? What's happening?" No one answered her. All eyes were on Solène. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look vindictive. She looked resolute. She had given the Calder family a chance earlier that night, an unspoken invitation to behave as if they were still worthy of the $1.9 billion deal that could have saved them. They declined. So she rescinded the world they were clinging to, not loudly, not chaotically, but with the precision of someone removing a beating heart with surgical calm, and the mansion, once overflowing with opulence, felt suddenly, terrifyingly hollow. Notifications spread through the ballroom like a sudden electrical surge, small sparks at first, then a wave of illumination as screens lit up in trembling hands. People who moments earlier were sipping vintage champagne now stared down at their devices with expressions turning rapidly from confusion to disbelief to fear. A man near the orchestra whispered hoarsely, "This isn't market fluctuation. This is coordinated." Another tapped the screen, his voice cracking. "Liquidity freeze. Multiple accounts. This is catastrophic." None of these whispers reached Avery at first. She was too busy tracking the shifting faces around her, trying to understand why every pair of eyes had turned sharp, calculating, almost frightened. "What's happening?" she pleaded to no one in particular. "Why is everyone reacting like this?" She didn't see what her father saw. Richard Calder's face had drained of all color. Deep lines carved themselves into his expression as he scrolled through alert after alert. Each notification hit him like a physical blow. Hold, placed. Flagged for reassessment. Partnership retracted. Pending contract voided. His lungs tightened, his throat locked. Years of carefully built dominance. Decades of reputation. An empire of legacy all flickering, trembling, collapsing in the palm of his hand. His wife grasped his arm. "Richard, talk to me. What does this mean?" He could barely form the words. "It means," he choked, "we're being pulled apart." A sound escaped her. Small, breathless, terrified. Avery finally snatched her father's phone out of his hand. What are you two talking about? Her sentence died. Her expression shattered. What is this? She whispered, staring at the brutal cascade of red alerts. All of our accounts. Why are they locked? Why is everything? Richard closed his eyes. Because she pulled out. Avery froze. Who? Solène didn't move. She didn't need to answer. The room answered for her. Gasps turned into murmurs. Murmurs into speculation. Speculation into a storm. Guests began stepping away from the Calders not with cruelty, but with the instinctive withdrawal of people distancing themselves from a sinking ship. Even allies, old family friends and business partners who had dined at the Calder mansion for years, now shifted their posture, wearing the polite, sympathetic expressions reserved for lost causes. Avery's voice cracked. Someone explained to me how she could cause all of this. A man near the front said it without looking up from his phone. Because she's the one your father has been begging for months. The one investor who could have saved your empire, and you insulted her. Avery staggered backward. No, that's impossible. But the truth was spreading faster than the panic. Near the entrance, a line of board members exchanged devastating glances. One muttered, "If she's out, we're exposed." Another murmured, "This is systemic failure. It won't stop here." Richard tried to step toward Solène, but his knees nearly buckled. His voice was crushed under the weight of consequences he had feared and fought and denied for too long. "Miss Ward, please, we can correct this. We can find a solution." "There was a solution," Solène said softly. "You had it. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't gloating. The tone was simply factual. You lost it when respect left this room." A woman dressed in emerald looked between them with something close to awe. Not admiration, not fear. Something more primal, recognition of inevitability. Avery's breath shortened. She looked around, desperate for anyone to protect her. But the people who once cheered her now avoided her gaze. Privilege had evaporated. Power had migrated. And isolation settled onto Avery's shoulders like a punishment she had never imagined. She turned back to Solène, voice shaking violently. "Please, don't do this. You can't. You don't understand our name, our legacy." "Our legacies," Solène said, her gaze unwavering, "are defined by how we treat people when we believe no one is watching." The chandelier light struck her gown as she spoke, casting a halo-like shimmer across the marble, as though even the mansion had chosen its side. Avery took one final trembling breath. "Is there anything we can do?" Solène didn't blink. No. The word fell soft, gentle, devastating, and the Calder Empire won $9 billion of lineage. Ego and inherited dominance cracked audibly across the room, folding under the weight of a choice made hours earlier by a woman who believed disrespect had no place in her world. Tonight, the consequences arrived not like thunder but like dawn breaking. The collapse didn't stay inside the mansion. It leaked fast. Phones buzzed again, this time with alerts from news outlets and finance networks that somehow obtained whispers of the sudden freeze inside the Calder Empire. Screens around the ballroom glowed with headlines forming in real time, fragmented but unmistakable. Major investor withdraws Calder holdings in crisis. Emergency review triggered. Guests exchanged looks that needed no words. This was no longer gossip. This was an autopsy. A board member near the balcony stepped away to take a call, only to return pale, lips tight. Another guest checked her email and pressed a hand to her chest. "It's already moving," she whispered. "Markets are responding." Avery watched it unravel from the center of the room, her family name evaporating like mist under a rising sun. Solène didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stood in the stillness she created, the calm eye of a storm she never needed to raise her voice for. Around her, alliances shifted, reputations reshaped, history rewrote itself in whispers. And everyone knew. The night was no longer about an insult. It was about consequence. While panic rippled through the mansion, Solène moved with quiet precision. She stepped toward the event host, reaching into her clutch and withdrawing a slim envelope sealed with a deep green wax crest. No flourish, no performance, just intention. "This," she said softly, is my contribution." The host opened it, eyes widening at the figure inside, a seven-figure donation redirected not toward the Calder Foundation, but toward community schools, local housing programs, and minority-owned small business grants. Causes the Calders had long ignored while polishing their legacy. Guests murmured, stunned, not just by the amount, but by the direction. One woman whispered, "She didn't just pull out, she rerouted the future." Avery watched, hollow, as the crowd's posture shifted again, not toward pity, not toward shock, but toward quiet admiration for the woman who dismantled an empire without raising her voice. Solène simply said, "Power should heal, not humiliate." And in that moment, the room understood who the true architect of the night was. By the time the last chandelier dimmed, the Calder name was already unraveling beyond the mansion walls. Overnight reports circulated, analysts speculated, and markets shifted quietly, confirming what the ballroom had witnessed: a dynasty undone by its own arrogance. Solène walked toward the exit, the train of her white gown drifting across marble like a drawn line separating what had been from what would never be again. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The echo of her footsteps carried more authority than any closing speech could. Behind her, murmurs filled the hollowed empire shed just dismantled, some in awe, some in regret, all in recognition. At the doorway, dawn light spilled in, soft and gold. It touched her shoulders like a coronation. Power had never needed volume. Dignity had never needed permission. And justice, tonight, arrived in silk and silence. Solène stepped into the morning. The world followed,